We have our second featured speaker is one we're very lucky to have join us virtually through the magic of technology. Dr. Anthony Klotz coined the term the Great Resignation. You've maybe heard of that. While professor of management at the Texas A&M Mays School of Business, he is now associate professor at University College in London. He will be sharing the drivers of this phenomenon, the Great Resignation, and how businesses can address the issues involved in the Great Resignation. As I mentioned, Dr. Klotz will be joining live from University College London's School of Management. Dr. Klotz, please take it away.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here with you today. Hope all is well in Akron. I'm coming to you from London. And as was just mentioned, I'm going to talk to you today about the Great Resignation, partly the causes of it, and then also where we're currently at in this moment of unrest in the world of work. But probably what's going to be most useful is when we move into what can organizations do in this moment of change, in this moment of uncertainty, to position themselves to not only get out of the Great Resignation stronger than a few years ago, but really embrace the future of work. This is a moment of opportunity. And so if I may, I'll start by talking about the 4 causes of the Great Resignation. How did we get here? And I think it's important to revisit these to realize there are so many articles out there right now saying like, here's the one thing that you need to do in this moment to retain people, to engage individuals and so forth. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the world of work isn't so simple, that there's a silver bullet out there for what's going on right now. And because the pandemic was so unique, the other events of 2020 were so unique, it's really created a challenge for people, for organizational leaders to respond to this. And that's not because they're not trying or they're not talented. It's because this is maybe one of the great leadership challenges that we've had in a century, if not ever, in terms of changes to the world of work all happening at once. And so what are these different causes of the Great Resignation? Well, the first is pretty straightforward, and it happens whenever there's a recession. It's a backlog of resignations in the economy. And so you can imagine that 2020 was a time of great uncertainty. So even if you wanted to leave your job then, or you were thinking about it, most individuals said, actually, I think I'll wait and see how this pandemic plays out before I leave my job and add more uncertainty to my life. And so as I'll show on a graph shortly, we saw resignations really drop off in 2020. And so usually though, economies are pretty slow to come out of recessions. And so as economies come out of recessions, the resignation numbers slowly tick back up. This was unique because it wasn't just a recession, it was a pandemic. And so when the vaccines came online, that whole backlog of resignations all of a sudden came forward pretty quickly. And you had many individuals deciding to resign at the beginning of 2021 and through 2021, which created this immense tightness in the labor market. And so how quickly, I'm not saying the pandemic ended quickly or that it's over, but how quickly sort of the economy bounced back from the pandemic created this wave of initial resignations, which created a lot of tightness. What was also very unique about this moment in the world of work back in 2020, early 2021, was the widespread levels of burnout in the economy. And we were no strangers to burnout before 2020, right? This has been with us for a long time. But what struck me as unique was how widespread stress and burnout were in the economy at the end of 2020. So you had the frontline workers in healthcare and retail and food service who were helping us get through the pandemic. And then you had organizational leaders who were trying to lead their companies through the pandemic, and the middle managers who were caught in the middle of it. And then many of you trying to educate your children full-time while hold down a full-time job. So as we'll talk about a little bit more later, one of the only cures for burnout is to get away from the thing that's burning you out. And so that's why burnout is a predictor of turnover. And it struck me that we've probably never seen levels of burnout like we had at the end of 2020. And so again, with the vaccines and the economy opening up fairly quickly, it gave people an opportunity to take a break from the workforce or just to switch jobs, which can be a cure from burnout, to get away from it and to move into another job. Probably the most unique element of the pandemic was that it was a public health crisis. And there's a wonderfully named theory in psychology called terror management theory, that when we have death and illness near us in our lives, as we did on the nightly news during 2020, we tend to think big, deep, existential thoughts. Am I living my life the way that I want to live? And when we ask those big questions, we tend to ask, am I living a life of meaning? And am I living a life of happiness? And because we spend so much of our time at work, we look at our jobs and say, is that providing me a source of meaning? Is that providing me a source of happiness? So what was unique is, we all go through our, quarter life crises or midlife crises every once in a while. But the pandemic, because it was this massive public health crisis, and remember 2020, there were other massive events going on, like the Black Lives Matter movement, like a really polarizing election. There were just a lot of elements that were causing people to reflect on their life and saying, is my work making me happy? Is my work providing me with a source of meaning? And if the answer is no, the lockdown gave individuals plenty of time. And in some cases, they saved up resources, like household debt actually went down in 2020. They saved up the resources to make a major life pivot. And so not only have we seen high levels of job changes within the same industry during the Great Resignation, but there's also been record high levels of career changes, high levels of early retirements, high levels of increased entrepreneurial activity. So individuals deciding, I'm going to make a pivot professionally. I'm going to do something different with my life. And the fourth and final cause of the Great Resignation, or the spike of resignations, was of course, the remote work revolution. So remote work existed before 2020, but the experiment that the world of work went through in terms of, I think, bringing the world of work from like 2030 or 2040 into 2020 was something like we've never seen before. So millions of individuals working remotely. And what was unique to me is I don't think, remote work has its own set of pros and cons. It's not better or worse than in-person work. But what is unique about remote work is it provides workers with more autonomy, more freedom in terms of how they structure their workday than in-person work. There's really no getting around that. And because the pandemic went on for so long, you had people working remotely for a year and a half, now 2 years. And we know from the expatriation literature that when you go to another culture, you have this rough adjustment, you go through culture shock, but then you adjust, you change who you are, and you get used to this new culture. And it was clear to me that there were millions of workers who went through sort of the tough adjustment of switching to this different work arrangement. But it's a different work arrangement that provides people with more autonomy. And then when you ask people to willingly give up a little bit of autonomy, a little bit of freedom to come back to a different situation, as human beings, we're not wired to willingly give up freedom or autonomy. And so it was clear there was going to be tension that continues to this day about individuals saying, how much freedom do I want in work? What type of work arrangement do I want? And of course, many of you work in environments that can't be made remote, that are in-person work environments and need to be that way. And really, the fact that like half of the workforce was able to work remotely created a bit of inequity in the overall workforce. There's an economist at Stanford named Nick Bloom, and he's done a bunch of research that's shown getting to work remotely is equivalent to a 6% raise in pay. That's what workers value it at, approximately 6%. And so you can imagine if you have a workforce that's made up of in-person workers and people who are remote workers, that essentially letting half your workforce work remotely, the in-person workers are saying, they got a much better deal, and yet where's my raise? Where's my adjustment? And so there was some inequity built in. And so it took a while to explain that, these different elements that are at play here. But the reason I did that is just to paint a picture of the complexity of what's going on in the labor market right now. The pandemic didn't affect any one of us the same way. We all experienced it a little bit differently. And so these different factors that are at play, and of course, I didn't even mention things like vaccine mandates and other things we've had go on over the last few years that have contributed to resignations and confusion in the workplace. But if your head is spinning a little bit by everything that I just talked about, that's because there was just an immense amount of change and a number of factors at play that contributed to this increase in resignations. So that's essentially what got us here to this increase in resignations. But how big was this increase really? And if you'll bear with me for a moment, I'm going to pull up some slides and sort of walk you through what is and is not happening with the workforce, or has happened with the Great Resignation, because there has been some, I think, mischaracterization out there of it. And so what I'm showing you right now on the screen is just the rate of quitting in the United States in 2019, so pre-pandemic. And this is just the percentage each month, what percent of the US workforce voluntarily quits their job. The Bureau of Labor Statistics sends out a survey and creates this estimate every month. They've been doing it only since 2000. So as you can see here, 2019, the resignation, or maybe you can't see, I'll tell you, the resignation rate in the US was right at about 2.4, 2.3%. Pretty steady. That means 2 to 3 to 2.4% of the workforce voluntarily left their jobs in any given month. You can add that up over the course of the year to the 30% or so that it would end up being the amount of people who turn over in a given year. Now, if we go forward one slide, what I map on top of this is what happened in 2020, so the year of the pandemic. And as you can see, resignations drop way down to 1.6%, which reflects, like, you know, there were layoffs, there was lots of uncertainty, not a good time to quit your job in February, March, April of 2020. And then you see it starting to rebound, and by the end of the year, get back to 2019 levels. And I think at that point, at the end of 2020, there was this optimism that with the vaccines coming online, you know, people wanted to get back to normal, right? I know most of us were saying, like, when's this going to end? Let's get back to normal. And so that was part of the expectation. On the next slide, I'm going to remove 2020 and layer 2021 on top of this. And so 2019 is still there. And then here comes the increase in resignations. And you can see it goes up to 2.8. And by the end of the year, we're up at 3%. And so that's, I don't know, 25% or so higher than 2019. And so that was sort of the jump that a lot of you were probably feeling in terms of turnover of your workforce. It wasn't, you know, there was talk that everybody was quitting, and it may have felt that way, but we jumped up to that 3% mark. But at the end of 2021, the thought was, how much higher can this possibly go? Is it going to keep going up, up and up? At the same time, the economy was still doing pretty strong. But you did have a lot of organizations, including some of you, I'm sure, in the audience, making adjustments, responding to this, increasing pay, increasing benefits, giving employees more flexibility, sort of responding to this increased turnover. And that made a difference. If we move ahead one more slide, you can see that if all I did was move out from 2021 all the way out to where we are today, and you can see we got up to 3%, but it's leveled off. If you look at these last 8 months in the maroon, that essentially means that our resignation rate has been flat or trending downward so far this year. And so, you know, if you believe that the Great Resignation happened, the question is it still ongoing? Well, if anything, it's plateauing or it's stalled, or you could even say it's potentially over, because in many ways it's starting to creep back down. Now, of course, there's a lot of variance depending on the industry. And so the first thing I wanted to show you is what the Great Resignation is and is not over the course of the last few years. Resignation rates are up from where they were in 2019, but it's the idea that everyone's quitting isn't quite accurate. I think it's also important for us to zoom out a little bit and say, a reporter asked me the other day, like, why is work so dysfunctional right now? Is work so much more dysfunctional than it was in 2019 or 2018? And my answer was no, I don't think it was. I think the pandemic just shined a light on some dysfunctions that we've been seeing growing over the last decade. And so if we move to the next slide, this is zooming out a little bit, and this is in thousands, and on the side, so that would be 2 million up to 5 million on the y-axis. This is looking at the last 10 years of resignations. And they've slowly been creeping up in terms of raw numbers. This is by the thousands. If you look at the next slide, this is our rate again. And what you see here is back in 2012, the rate of resignations was like 1.5. And now it's at 3, 10 years later, 2.7, 2.83. And so if it seems like people are quitting now more than they were 10 years ago, the data completely support that. And so part of what we need to focus on is not just what happened in the last couple of years and how do we respond to it, but is there an overall weakening in the relationship between employees and work, between employers and employees, that seems to be creating more of these short-term work arrangements versus probably what a lot of us would like to see is longer-term relationships. And so when I talk to a lot of HR professionals, what they often say is a lot of the problems you're identifying, Anthony, these were problems before 2020. The pandemic just sort of exacerbated them, made them worse. And this slide would back that up, that yes, a lot of the issues that we were seeing in terms of burnout, in terms of harassment, in terms of the weakening relationship between organizations and employees has been happening for a while. Now, because I'm speaking to Akron, I'll go more quickly through these, but I like to pull up the Bureau of Labor Statistics also breaks this down by state. And so I'm going to go through the same thing by state, just so you know what's going on in Ohio. And so if we go to the next slide, you see these same charts. So this is 2019, pre-pandemic in Ohio. And even though it's a little bit more sporadic, which makes up and down, which makes sense, because it's a smaller sample, you can see that it's pretty in line with the US in terms of like the 2.3, 2.4, 2.5% average, although it bounces around a little bit more. And then on the next slide, the pandemic comes and you can see in Ohio, resignation rates dropped to the same 1.6% level that was in the US, but actually rebounded maybe a little bit more quickly than the rest of the US did. And then again, I'll layer on the next slide, layer on top 2021. And you can see throughout 2021, the rate of resignations just kept growing in Ohio, and they kept growing early in this year. And so if you go to that final and next slide, that actually is up until now in Ohio. We only have the numbers through July. But if you look in February, 3.3%, that's quite a high resignation rate. And so if any of you are feeling the pain of employee turnover, particularly acutely in December, January, February, you weren't alone. Those numbers peaked there. What's interesting is that those rates in Ohio, you can see have come back down, almost to 2019 or below 2019 levels. And then we can go to the next slide just to back out a little bit and see the trend is there as well for the overall amount of resignations over the last 10 years in Ohio. You can see that, again, there's more variance in there, but it's creeping up just like the national number is. And then finally, this last slide, and then I'm done graphing the audience to sleep. But you can see on this last slide, total Ohio quits by month. This is the rate. And you can see that the rates have climbed over the last 10 years. But what's interesting to me, and I think what speaks to the moment that we're in the world of work right now, is if you look at the most recent numbers at the far right, they're coming down. They're dropping off. And so the question is, we're in this moment of disruption in the world of work. And what is going to happen next? And I think it's largely up to you all, to organizational leaders, to say, we have a lot of tools that have been brought from the future of work into the present. We've learned a lot. We're in this moment of disruption. Do we want to go back to the world of work of 2019, to the way things were? That's sort of tempting, that's comfortable. Or do we have a chance to rebuild the employee-employer relationship a little bit more, to try to use these tools and what we've learned in this moment to focus on employee well-being, to focus on healthy employee productivity, to just learn more about our employees and what's going on, and to put practices in place such that if we look at this chart 2 years from now, 5 years from now, it's flattened, or it's going down. This was a moment where we, instead of saying, you know what, employees aren't loyal anymore, you know what, organizations aren't loyal anymore, that's just the way it is, to actually say this moment of disruption, the pandemic was really painful, but in this moment of disruption, we made decisions that made the future of work better. And so with that, I can we can move away from the graphs and move on to the next portion. And so I've talked about what maybe caused the Great Resignation, some of the different causes of it, what the Great Resignation is and is not. There is some hype in there. It's always good to get to the numbers and see, yes, resignations are up, maybe 25% from 2019. And 2019 was the highest we've had on record since 2000 when they've started record keeping. But it's not everything, but it has created an opportunity for us to change the way that we lead a little bit. And there is a bit of a conversation right now saying these resignation rates are dropping probably because the economy isn't doing as well. But some of you have insight, and I do as well, into talking to organizations that are within the same industry. And I've been able to observe companies that have said, look, this moment of disruption is tough, but we're going to use it to move forward, to try to embrace new ways of working. And then there's other organizations in the same industry that are sort of clinging to the past. And I can tell you, when I talk to leaders of those organizations, they're having a very different experience in terms of whether the Great Resignation continues or it doesn't. And so if the economy was the main driver of what's causing resignations to start to plateau or drop off, you would think you would see that similarly across all organizations, and yet that's not the case. And so so this is a moment to reimagine work. And what I'm going to try to do is give you a number of ideas for how you can push back against the Great Resignation, how you can make the world of work better and learn from what's happened over the past couple of years and change the future of work. You might not agree with all of these suggestions, or I'm sure they won't work for every organization, but hopefully they give you some ideas that you can adapt that will work in your workplace. And one concept I think that's helpful to capture employees' mindsets right now is we use this concept called the psychological contract. And there's this, so we've studied psychological contracts for like 20 or 30 years. And you can think like employees have their actual contract of what they sign up to do at work and what the organization provides to them. But that's different than the psychological contract. Every employee walks in with an idea or a perception of here's what I'm responsible for in this job, and here's what the organization is supposed to provide me. And usually when you start a job, your psychological contract feels pretty good. You just started that role. But at some point, one party or the other breaches that contract most of the time. Maybe there was something the company didn't tell you when they hired you, or maybe as a worker, you fall short because something happens where you're not being as dedicated as you said you would. But overall, in talking to employees and seeing so many reports coming out about the world of work right now, the overall psychological contract that employees have is changing in that they just expect a little more out of work for their time. And that's manifesting in many different ways, from like, I'd like to be paid a little bit more, to I'd like my work to fit my talents a little bit better, to I'd like work to be a little bit more meaningful. But what's clear to me is the psychological contract that employees walk in the door with, or that employees came back from the pandemic with, is different than the one they had a few years ago, in terms of their expectations being a little higher, and in terms of them being a little bit more sensitive to organizations violating their psychological contract. And so what's important, I think, for organizations to do is to learn about how their employees feel right now, and then develop a plan to respond to it, to meet the expectations that employees have. And often we think about pay, but I think there's more meaningful levers that can be pulled. And so let's start with just the act of resignation, because what a lot of companies have realized over the last couple of years is that they've really overlooked the offboarding process as an opportunity to learn from their employees, to retain employees, and to gain a competitive advantage in the talent marketplace. And so one tip that I would provide is to ask yourself, what are you doing in terms of your employee offboarding program? You definitely have an onboarding program, I would guess, that brings employees into the company and introduces them to the different work tasks that they have and different people and so forth, and makes them feel like a part of the organization. But overall, companies have ignored offboarding, and that makes good sense. From some perspectives, like it's not pleasant when an employee quits. It can be kind of painful, and also that person is leaving the organization. So what's the point in really dwelling on it or thinking about it? What we know from the psychology of resignations is there's much to be gained now more than ever to being much more deliberate and thoughtful when it comes to offboarding employees. And so one element of that would come to, are your managers trained? Do your managers know what to do when an employee says that he or she is quitting? Because it's a pretty emotional situation many of us have been in when we're a leader and one of our top performers says they're leaving. But in that moment, the resigning employee is looking for how their manager is going to react. And if their manager reacts in a negative or defensive way, employees react with equal negativity and defensiveness. And the whole one of the goals of the resignation process is to actually learn why that person's leaving so that you can improve whatever that is in your company, like to actually learn. And many of us do exit interviews, but the research on exit interviews is not very kind in terms of how honest employees are in exit interviews. It's just like breaking up in the real world, where you try to spare the other person's feelings by saying it's not you, it's me. That's the reason we're breaking up. Employees do the same thing in exit interviews, and so it's important to think about, let's give our managers training when it comes to offboarding employees. And one of the first questions managers should of course ask is what element of the job, what one aspect or what two aspects are sort of driving you to this decision. And hopefully managers have the power then to hear what those reasons are and see if they can fix it. Often an employee quits not because there's this rumor that everybody hates their jobs, or you sometimes see that in the media. That's not true. Most people like their jobs, but they quit because there's 20% of the job they don't like, or there's one thing they don't like, and they see greener grass that solves that 20%. So give managers the empowerment and the tools to see if they can quickly solve that issue, especially when it comes to a top performer leaving. When it comes to offboarding, also keep in mind that turnover contagion is very real. And so there probably should also be a plan to touch base with the stayers who are near that person who's leaving to make sure that they're doing okay and that they have what they need, because it can be pretty disruptive when your close coworker leaves. You're losing a friend. You're probably going to have to take on extra work because she's leaving. And it makes you think about, wait, if she's leaving for something better, what is that better thing? And should I be thinking about that as well? So even though it's a little bit painful, and as a manager, it's sort of a time of insecurity when an employee leaves, making sure that you check in with the stayers. And then finally, as leaders and HR professionals, we're always looking for new areas where we can recruit employees that we're not looking at before. And if you don't have a boomerang recruitment strategy as part of your offboarding plan or as part of your talent management plan, you're missing out on a pretty valuable recruiting opportunity. And what I mean by that is when a high performer is leaving in particular, why not set them up to potentially boomerang back and come back to the organization? So making sure that they're aware that they can come back, letting them know that you'll check in with them every once in a while, because there's, some people have talked about the last year as being the year of the great regret. We've known for a long time that employees often regret their decision to leave and would like to come back at some point. Bringing boomerang employees back is often a win for that person and a win for the organization, because you're bringing back a high performer. I talked to one organization that was going so far as to say, when one of our top performers leave, we give that person a 1-year leave of absence. And we just tell them, we know you're quitting and you want to go explore this sort of thing, but we're not going to necessarily take that for an answer. We're going to give you a 1-year leave of absence, and we're going to check in with you every month or two just to see how it's going. And if you want to come back during that year, if the grass isn't as green as you think it is, we'll bring you right back. And so part of this moment of responding to increased turnover is about focusing on it more from an organizational excellence standpoint and taking the offboarding process more seriously. Okay, so shifting gears, what about when it comes to employee well-being? I spoke about burnout, and this is a moment when stress, all these surveys say stress levels are high in the workplace. And there's this great discussion going on right now about a term that I'm sure all of you have heard and really love this term, quiet quitting, right? So there's this discussion going on, and we'll leave quiet quitting to the side. But the reason it's generated so much interest is because it's a discussion about where do the boundaries exist between employees' expected tasks and everything above and beyond that. And as organizational psychologists, we've studied citizenship behaviors, everything above and beyond, for a long time, and said citizenship behaviors can make employees feel good, and they definitely contribute to the organization. And going back to that psychological contract, this is a moment when a lot of employees are saying, why do we have to go above and beyond? Over the past couple of years, my job has grown such that now I'm expected to do more than I've ever done before. And that's contributing to stress. And we do have lots of research that shows that even though citizenship at a moderate level can be good for the employee, especially from a career standpoint, it also leads to work-life balance problems. It also leads to burnout. And job creep is real. Job creep meaning this very slow and subtle expansion of job duties that happens over time. And I think so this is a moment for organizations to be honest with themselves and say, how big have employees' jobs gotten? How much are we expecting of employees in terms of going above and beyond? It might feel like every once in a while we have employees stay late, but are you tracking that? I mean, are you seeing how much have the lines between work, the work hours that employees are expected to perform, and then the evenings are actually blurring together? So this is probably a moment to do an audit as managers, as leaders, and say, all right, this quiet quitting thing isn't the most enjoyable thing to talk about, but is there a kernel of truth in here in terms of how much employees' jobs have grown beyond what we hired them for, and so forth? And some companies, I'm a huge fan of experimenting with different solutions to problems like this. The industry of investment banking has long had a reputation for being an industry that really burns out employees, that pays them a lot, right, but burns them out. And so I saw Citibank is doing an experiment, and obviously they're a large organization, so they can do these sorts of experiments, where they said, okay, we know investment banking burns employees out, but a lot of people seek that out. That they want to work the 100 hours a week and get the big paychecks that go along with it and so forth. But there's also a lot of people who are interested in investment banking, but not interested in burning out their lives in order to pursue it. And so Citibank is actually opening a separate office in Spain where it's only going to be 40-hour work weeks, and it pays half of what the investment bankers in London and New York get paid. And so you may have different thoughts about that experiment, but as an organizational psychologist, it's exciting to me to think that a company would say, okay, we're going to hire you, you're going to be a great future investment banker. There are trade-offs to this profession. There's the high paying where we expect pretty much your whole life to revolve around investment banking. And then there's where there's another path here that's also investment banking. This doesn't compensate quite as highly, but you can have a life. Since they've announced that, there's been lots of pushback and debate, but I like it as an example of saying, can we experiment with different ways of working such that workers can sort of consciously choose how much they want to go above and beyond? Keep in mind when it comes to burnout, I said one of the cures is quitting, but one of the best ways to recover from burnout is to make sure that employees can psychologically detach from work at different points in their day, in their week, and in their year. So breaks during the workday, evenings after work, weekends, and then holidays and vacations. Are you really letting your employees detach during those periods of time? There's this wonderful, depressing research that shows if you have a week vacation and you don't engage in any work during that week, it's really restorative and a really good cure for burnout. But if you check your work email once during that week, like almost all of the benefits go away. So the benefits of really truly psychologically detaching from work and not coming back to a huge pile of work after that vacation, after that weekend, after that evening are critical. So making sure that you're being honest with yourself about our employees being able to psychologically detach from work. And then the final thing I'll say about burnout, burnout is a safety issue as well. So I think it's useful to think about it in terms of safety. Many of you have programs like when you see something, say something, and the same should be true for burnout. And burnout is not just indicated by exhaustion, which is what a lot of us think of. It's also indicated by a cynical attitude. So if you have an employee that used to be really positive, but has developed this sort of cynical attitude, that's a sign that they may be getting burnt out. The other thing is when we see employees who are burnt out, they often have a reduced sense of accomplishment. Like they can't do their job as well as they once did. And they're often like, yeah, my best days are behind me. And so if you have a high performer that looks a little bit exhausted, that looks a little bit defeated, or that's developed a cynical attitude, though, be aware those are the signs of burnout, and those early warning signs are important to catch. So developing programs so that you look out for one another in the workplace, I think, is critical. Okay, I have a few minutes left. I'll give you a few more tips. Remember I said there's this wonderfully named theory, terror management. Many people continue to reevaluate their lives right now. So the pandemic was this huge event that had a big impact on individuals in the way that I talked about. But some people have said this wasn't just a pandemic. We've also entered into the age of the infodemic. Every day or two, I look at my phone and see something fairly shocking, negative event that's happened. And so what that means is more and more, you look at your phone and there's a war in Ukraine, or there's been a school shooting, or whatever it may be. And in each one of those events will cause this terror management reaction in some of your workers. And so it's been observed that we're living in a day where people are reevaluating their lives more often than they used to, just because we have so much information coming at us, which isn't pleasant, but as leaders, we have to deal with it. The nice thing is when people are looking for like a source of meaning, work can provide that, but it doesn't happen by default. Work is not meaningful, full stop. Work is meaningful when organizational leaders and companies imbue jobs with work and let employees know how what they're doing has a positive impact on the world. How does their job make a difference? And so there's been a lot of talk over the last year about culture and what about culture when it comes to remote work or hybrid work? How do we keep culture going? Honestly, I don't think employees are that interested in culture right now. I think they're interested in purpose. And so I think as leaders, I would shift much more towards talking about the purpose of your organization and how it has a positive impact on the world, and connecting employees' work to that positive impact much more than the culture family discussions that I hear going on. Don't get me wrong, culture is important, but I'd rather have a workforce that believes that they have a strong purpose than feels that they have a strong culture. Culture is very inward looking. Purpose is much more inspirational. So I think this is the time, during the last couple of years, a lot of leaders have gotten away from vision-based leadership, and now is the time to get back to it. And also keep in mind, when it comes to an employee who has that big realization, I want to do something different with my life, or I need a change, if you're working closely with that employee, they'll probably tell you that if you have a good relationship with them. And we have more tools than ever to accommodate people's life pivots. And so I would challenge you to think through situations like, if an employee comes to me and describes a problem where he would actually like, if possible, to go part-time for the next year or for the next month, many of us would instantly think, no, we can't have one employee going part-time. That would break these rules. We can't bend that way. Or an employee who says, can I just take a year off unpaid? Or can I do this? Can I do that? I think we have the ability to be more flexible than ever. And the days of like, I can't give that to you because I gave it to you, I have to give it to everyone, are sort of gone. Employees are expecting more flexibility, and innovative companies, forward-thinking companies have the ability to be flexible in those ways. And so broaden your mind to different ways of arranging work for employees from that perspective. The final thing I'll talk about in the few minutes I have left is, of course, remote working continues to be a big conversation piece, and how do we get remote versus hybrid versus in-person. I think any discussion of this sort of misses the point underlying these ways of working is really flexibility. And so, yeah, remote work provides a lot of flexibility, but I think this is a great time to talk to in-person workers about what would improved flexibility mean for you. Like, would it be schedule flexibility? Would it be the flexibility to put 2 of your vacation weeks together? So this is a great time just to talk to your in-person workers as well as non-in-person workers about what flexibility means to them. And of course, explain the business reasons, the business constraints on whether that type of flexibility is possible or not. I also think we're moving beyond the conversation for people who can work away from in-person work. We're moving beyond the conversation of what's better, remote or in-person. And we're sort of getting back to the good old job analysis and saying, what aspects of this person's work can be done remotely, is best done in person, is best done as a team. And so that we have like sort of an evidence-based approach to whether it's going to be all remote, hybrid, or all in person. Because that's what employees are looking for right now, is an explanation for why we're choosing a 3-day hybrid or whatnot. One lesson I will say for those of you who are working in hybrid systems or managing in hybrid systems is the evidence is becoming pretty clear that if you're going to have employees say come to the office 3 days a week or 2 days a week, you should probably have everybody come to the office on the same days. So that cuts into employees' freedom a little bit. Like me as an employee, I want to choose what 3 days I want to come in. I think more and more organizations are saying, if we're going to do this, it makes sense. Everybody comes in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays, or something like that. Okay, so almost done. Got 1 minute left. What I will say is, so I threw out a bunch of different tips sort of all over the place to deal with these different causes of the Great Resignation. Many of them require frontline managers and middle managers to work closely with their direct reports, to really get to know them and to understand what's going on in the minds of their workers in a way that pulse surveys can't get at, that other sorts of HR analytics can't necessarily get at. So the last question I would want you to ask yourself is do our middle managers, do our frontline managers have the bandwidth to build strong relationships with their direct reports? What's their span of control right now? How many people are they managing? And so that's probably the last tip or question I would give. Overall, I would say this is a great moment for the world of work in general. It may feel a little bit uncomfortable, but I think if we embrace this moment, we will look back in a few years and say, that was unpleasant to go through, but the world of work that we have now is more sustainable, more inclusive, and better for human well-being than it was in 2019 and before. And I will stop there, and I appreciate everybody bearing with me during that lecture and chatting.
Thank you so much, Dr. Klotz. Really insightful. As I was coming up with questions myself during the presentation, it felt like he would then address that question. So I'm sure there are plenty of questions from the audience into that insightful presentation. Please again scan the QR code here on the screen and submit your questions. I will review those and ask them to Dr. Klotz as we move along. I'll once again maybe just start with one of my own. And that's, I found it really interesting that you talked about the offboarding process as a really key component to, finding out, why employees are resigning. And I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about, you said, oh, the exit interviews, historically employees then aren't, necessarily very honest or forthcoming. And talking about having the manager do that instead. And if you could just talk a little bit about like the psychological safety that a manager needs to set up and how that relationship evolves. It doesn't just happen when the employee is resigning, right? This is a relationship that's being built over time. So how do you set up that psychological safety with employees where it makes it so the manager is the right person? Because I could see an employee not telling the manager, hey, it's you, and you're the reason I'm leaving, right? So I guess, is the manager the right person to be doing that? And then how does that person set up that relationship over time to ensure they're getting the information they need?
Yeah, well, you grabbed part of the answer that I would give by moving ahead to psych safety, because I think that is the key element of it. And psych safety is built through one of the two people showing vulnerability, and I think that was mentioned in the last talk. And so part of it comes from that last question I asked is do your managers have the bandwidth and the training to build close relationships with their direct reports? So I've researched these different styles of resigning, and when managers have close relationships with employees, those employees will often tell managers before they resign when they're thinking about switching jobs, going back to school or whatnot. They take the risk, they let themselves be vulnerable, and they let their managers know ahead of time, hey, I'm thinking about moving elsewhere. And so this is much easier said than done to get managers to build these deep relationships. But I think it comes from training managers on showing vulnerability and building trusting relationships. And the other component is giving managers the time and training them to listen, because a lot of what I talked about, these changes that employees are going through and are going to continue to go through over the next however long, it requires creating space, one-on-one space, really, not team-based space, one-on-one space for managers to connect with their direct reports and listen to what's going on in their work lives, in their personal lives. And that's how trust is built. And then when it comes to that employee leaving, that dynamic is built of the manager will listen to what's going on and be thoughtful about what you're experiencing in your life. But what I'm describing takes an investment in time, but time is really money. So looking at your middle managers, like how much are they overloaded, our frontline managers? If they're really overloaded, then they're probably not the best ones to do the exit interview, which will even lower the value of the exit interview even more.
Thank you for that. That's actually a really great segue into the first question that came in, which is, you mentioned how big employees' jobs have gotten beyond what they were hired for. How can you address the overloaded job duties for employees with management when your organization runs very lean and wouldn't want to add any headcount?
Yeah, so I think that's a difficult conversation. If your organization runs really lean, I think the leaders of the organization need to be honest with themselves about the problems that's going to create in terms of the ability to develop relationships with employees, in terms of I think it's going to result in higher turnover, which zero turnover is not the goal here, right? So some turnover is perfectly fine, but running lean creates a situation where you're either burning out employees because you're asking more of them than you're giving back, or you say, you know what, we're going to ask them to work a lot, but we're going to pay them a lot and we're going to compensate them a lot for it. Both of those are fine strategies, but probably not great strategies to build lasting, strong relationships. And we're talking about employees as though they're all the same, which clearly isn't the case. But I think organizations that like to run really lean and maybe have small margins, they're the ones that are most susceptible to some of these resignation forces that we've seen, which is why industries like retail and food service have seen the biggest spikes during the last few years of turnover. So yeah, I think if you want to run lean, that's fine. That's a conscious decision, but it comes with a set of headaches in terms of managing people.
Imagining the work relationship that we can learn from, and I would argue that it's probably already different going into it, right, between the US and European countries, but what can we learn from other countries that are reimagining the work relationship?
Oh, that's a good question. So part of it has to do, like, the easy answer is like, and this is psychological detachment, which I talked about. You know, I've only been in Europe or in London, right, for a summer, and people's out of office assistants really are totally different here than they are in the US. It's like, I'm going to be gone for 2 weeks. I'm not answering this, and I'm going to hit delete on everything that came in during the 2 weeks when I get back. I'm not going to come back to a pile of emails. So if it's really important, email me again in 2 weeks. I just got that out of office this morning. And in the US, I don't remember really ever seeing those out of office. And so I think other countries really do take psychological detachment much more seriously than the US, which is why you see lower burnout levels. The other thing has to do with identity. So how much of our sense of self and our self-worth is attached to our job. And surveys have shown that it's very high in the United States. Who I am as a person, like if I had a bunch of circles I drew, the different roles in my life, and then I had to make them as big as they are in terms of their meaning to me and their centrality to me. In the United States, we often put our profession and our job as like very important and very central to who we are. And that's not always the most healthy approach. And so this is a moment, I think the reason the Great Resignation has been stronger in the US than any other country, which is what the statistics would suggest, is because so much of how we define ourselves is as a worker. And so when we have that quarter life crisis or pandemic crisis, and think like, does my life have meaning? And you look at your job, and if the answer is no, it's pretty devastating. Whereas if you have a little bit healthier balance, you can say, well, my job doesn't need to be everything because I've got these rich other aspects of who I am. And so from a balance perspective, I think there's quite a bit to learn from other countries as well.
Thank you. We'll make this our last question. There are so many. I wish I could send them all to you and have you respond to all of them, but this will make this our last one before our break. Do you think the Great Resignation has made constructs such as organizational loyalty and organizational commitment obsolete?
Yeah, that's a big question and a good question. I don't think so at all, and I'll give like a sort of halfway evidence-based answer. When I teach these very hard charging type A personality MBAs, I ask them this question I say, would you rather, if you have a career where you leave this MBA and you become an executive VP in 20 or 30 years, would you rather have your career path go through the same company for the next 20 or 30 years? Or would you rather have your career path bounce around all these different companies? In the hands that are raised is about 50-50. Individuals, like in general, like the amount of commitment, I think is the same as it ever. People want that level of commitment, but I think there's a bit of a standoff right now in terms of employees not being loyal, organizations lay off. And so I'm pretty hopeful that the resignation rates will continue to come down, mainly because organizations are making big investments right now in employees, and you're seeing employees reciprocate with loyalty. So that's a bit of an evidence-based answer and a bit of just a rose-colored glasses answer, but there's no reason that I see to believe that the commitment from human beings toward their jobs has left permanently.
Interesting. I'm so glad that you brought up, the great regret. I was going to say rebound, because, right, I think, the organizational loyalty might look a little bit different even if they leave. You've talked about some, how they come back as well. And I think, right, the commitment that the organizations are making, and then just that the employees realize, oh gosh, I really did like it there, might contribute to that too. So.
Yeah, it's that whole you don't know what you got till it's gone, and it happens with employees as well.
Exactly. Well, I wish we had another whole, 30 minutes with you, but in the interest of our schedule, we'll have to let you go. There were plenty of questions. Thank you from the audience for these meaningful questions. Dr. Klotz, thank you so much for logging in whatever time it is there. And, we appreciate you streaming in to join us today. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.